The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the desolate gas station, nestled along a quiet highway surrounded by towering trees and rolling hills. It was the kind of place where travelers stopped briefly to refuel and stretch their legs before continuing on their way, leaving behind only the faint smell of gasoline and fading tire tracks. Dylan and Jack stood by their truck, a battered old pickup that had seen better days. Both men moved with a quiet efficiency, their camaraderie born from years of shared hardships. They weren't talkative by nature, and they didn't need to be. Their silence was comfortable, the kind forged in the heat of battle and long nights spent watching each other's backs. Jack, the older of the two, leaned against the truck, finishing the last few drops of a lukewarm soda. He squinted at the horizon, the light reflecting off his weathered face. "Not bad," he muttered, nodding toward the surrounding hills. "Quiet, peaceful, just what we needed." Dylan didn't reply. He was at the pump, his hand steady on the nozzle as he filled the truck's tank. His lean frame and sharp eyes spoke of discipline, a man accustomed to scanning his surroundings even in places where danger felt like a distant memory. The peace didn't last. The low growl of engines broke the stillness, faint at first but growing louder. Dylan's head snapped up, his gaze narrowing as a pack of motorcycles roared into view. The noise echoed through the hills like a storm rolling in, jarring and aggressive. 8 motorcycles pulled into the gas station, their riders exuding an air of unchallenged dominance. The leader, a burly man with a thick beard and a scar slashing across his brow, dismounted first. His leather jacket was adorned with patches, the largest of which read, "Steel Vultures." The group spread out like wolves claiming new territory. Their laughter was coarse and mocking as they jeered at the few other patrons at the station. A nervous teenage employee froze behind the counter, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the register. One biker shoved past an elderly woman struggling to pump gas, knocking her off balance. She stumbled, clutching her cane for support. The leader, whom the others called Crusher, sneered at her, yanking the nozzle from her hands. "Hurry it up, Grandma," he barked, spraying a little gasoline onto the pavement for emphasis. Dylan's jaw tightened, his hand curling into a fist. Jack noticed the shift in his friend's stance and sighed. "Don't do it," he murmured. "It's not our problem." But Dylan had already started moving. His boots crunched against the pavement as he approached the group, his expression calm but unyielding. Jack swore under his breath and followed, knowing there was no talking Dylan out of what was about to happen. "Leave her alone," Dylan said, his voice level but firm. Crusher turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the man standing before him. Dylan looked ordinary enough. Jeans, a plain t-shirt, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. But there was something in his stance, in the way he carried himself, that made Crusher hesitate. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" Crusher demanded, stepping closer until he loomed over Dylan. "Just someone telling you to back off," Dylan replied. The bikers burst into laughter, their voices grating against the peaceful backdrop of the hills. One of them slapped Crusher on the shoulder. "Looks like we've got ourselves a hero." Jack stepped up beside Dylan, his arms crossed. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice calm but with an edge that made even the laughter die down. "Walk away, now." Crusher's grin faltered, just for a moment, but then he shook it off, puffing out his chest. "Or what? You gonna teach me a lesson, old man?" Jack sighed, glancing at Dylan. "You remember what the sergeant always said?" Dylan nodded, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Don't start the fight, just make sure you finish it." Crusher stepped closer to Dylan, his boots crunching against the gravel-strewn pavement. The air felt heavy, crackling with unspoken threats. The steel vultures had formed a loose circle, their sneering faces illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights of the gas station. Some of them spun chains in their hands, while others cracked their knuckles, eager for a fight. But Dylan and Jack didn't flinch. They stood there, seemingly unarmed, their calm composure a stark contrast to the wild energy of the bikers. To anyone else, they might have looked like ordinary men, but the subtle shift in their stance, a slight repositioning of feet, hands resting loosely at their sides, told a different story. They were ready. Crusher's scarred lip twisted into a grin. "You don't know who you're messing with, do you?" he snarled. He jabbed a thick finger into Dylan's chest. "We run this stretch of road. And you? You're just another tourist." Dylan's eyes flicked down to the finger pressed against him, then back up to Crusher's face. He didn't speak. Instead, he let the silence stretch, unnerving enough that even the bikers began to shift uncomfortably. Jack sighed, breaking the tension. "You know," he said, his voice casual, "there's something funny about guys like you." Crusher turned his head, narrowing his eyes. "What the hell's that supposed to mean?" Jack tilted his head, his hands slipping into his pockets. "You act tough when it's 8 against 2, but deep down, you know how this is going to end." The grin vanished from Crusher's face. His jaw tightened as he took a step back. "Oh, I know how this ends," he growled, waving a hand toward his crew. "Teach these two a lesson." The first biker lunged, swinging a chain toward Dylan's head. But before it could land, Dylan moved with the precision of a coiled spring. He sidestepped the swing, grabbed the biker's wrist, and twisted it with a bone-snapping crack. The chain clattered to the ground as the man let out a howl of pain, cradling his arm. The gas station erupted into chaos. Another biker charged at Jack, a steel pipe raised high. Jack ducked under the swing, driving his elbow into the man's ribs with enough force to send him sprawling. Before the biker could recover, Jack grabbed the pipe and turned it against him, delivering a swift, incapacitating blow to his leg. Dylan was already taking down a third attacker, his movements efficient and brutal. A kick to the knee, an elbow to the jaw, each strike landed with surgical precision. Years of training had honed him into a weapon, and it showed. He didn't waste energy, didn't hesitate. Each motion was calculated to end the fight as quickly as possible. Crusher watched, his expression shifting from amusement to rage. "Enough!" he roared, pulling a knife from his belt. He stormed toward Dylan, the blade glinting in the flickering lights. But Dylan was ready. As Crusher swung the knife, Dylan caught his wrist midair. The two men struggled for a moment, muscles straining. But Dylan's calm strength began to overpower Crusher's brute force. With a swift twist, Dylan disarmed him, sending the knife skittering across the pavement. Crusher staggered back, his breath ragged, his bravado crumbling. He glanced around, realizing his crew was either on the ground or retreating. Only 2 bikers remained standing, and even they looked unsure, their weapons hanging limply at their sides. Jack stepped forward, twirling the steel pipe in his hand. His voice was low and steady. "Walk away, now." Crusher hesitated, his eyes darting between the 2 men. Then, with a snarl, he turned and spat on the ground. "You think this is over?" he barked. "You've made enemies tonight." Dylan wiped a trickle of sweat from his brow and shrugged. "We've had worse." Without another word, Crusher motioned for the remaining bikers to follow. They mounted their motorcycles, engines roaring as they sped off into the night, leaving behind a scene of broken pride and spilled fuel. As the dust settled, the gas station fell into an eerie silence. The young cashier peeked out from behind the counter, his face pale. "Are you guys cops or something?" he stammered. Jack chuckled, tossing the steel pipe aside. "Nah, just 2 guys trying to mind their own business." Dylan bent down to pick up the chain lying on the ground, examining it briefly before tossing it into a nearby trash can. "Let's get out of here," he said, his tone as calm as if nothing had happened. They climbed into their truck, the engine rumbling to life. As they pulled onto the highway, the glow of the gas station receding in the rearview mirror, Jack glanced over at Dylan. "Think they'll come back for round 2? Dylan smirked. "Let them try." But even as he spoke, a shadow of unease crept into his thoughts. Something about Crusher's parting words stuck with him. They'd faced plenty of threats in their time, but something told him this wasn't the last they'd see of the steel vultures. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness as Dylan and Jack cruised down the winding highway. The silence between them was heavy but familiar. Neither man needed to fill the void with words. After years in the military, they had grown used to reading each other's moods without asking questions. Jack finally broke the silence, his tone casual but laced with curiosity. "You noticed that patch on their jackets? The one that said Steel Vultures?" Dylan kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. "Yeah."
Biker gang.
"Probably local." Jack leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "Local gangs don't ride around like they own the damn place. That was organized. And Crusher, he wasn't bluffing when he said we'd made enemies." Dylan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. His mind was replaying the events at the gas station, analyzing every detail. Something about the way Crusher had looked at him, something cold and calculating beneath all the bravado, didn't sit right. "We'll keep an eye out," Dylan said finally, his voice low. "If they try anything, we'll handle it." Jack nodded, satisfied for the moment, but the uneasy feeling lingered as the miles rolled by. Hours later, they arrived at the secluded campsite they had been aiming for. The lake lay still and serene under the moonlight, its surface reflecting the star-strewn sky. It was the kind of peace Dylan and Jack had been seeking, an escape from the noise, the memories, and the constant hyper-awareness that came with years of combat. They worked in silence, setting up a small tent and building a modest fire. Jack broke out a flask of whiskey, passing it to Dylan as they sat by the crackling flames. "To quiet nights," Jack said, raising the flask in a mock toast. Dylan smirked and took a sip. "And to not having to break anyone's bones tomorrow." Jack laughed, the sound echoing across the water. For a moment, the tension eased. They talked about nothing in particular, old stories, bad jokes, the kind of banter that had kept them sane during the darkest days of their service. But their reprieve was short-lived. Around midnight, the faint sound of engines reached their ears. Dylan and Jack froze, their senses snapping into alertness. The hum grew louder, closer. It wasn't a single vehicle, it was a pack. Jack stood, his hand instinctively going to the knife strapped to his belt. "You think it's them?" Dylan didn't answer. He grabbed the flashlight from his bag and killed the fire with a quick stomp, plunging them into darkness. The two men moved silently toward the truck, using the shadows to stay hidden. The motorcycles appeared moments later, their headlights cutting through the forested trail leading to the campsite. Dylan counted at least 6 bikes. They stopped just short of the clearing, the engines idling as the riders dismounted. It was the Steel Vultures. Crusher stood at the front, silhouetted by the glow of a headlight. He wasn't smiling this time. Instead, his face was a mask of cold fury. "I told you this wasn't over," he called out, his voice carrying across the night. Jack muttered under his breath, "Guess we should have camped somewhere less scenic." Dylan motioned for him to stay quiet, his mind racing. The bikers hadn't spotted them yet, but it was only a matter of time. Their truck was parked in plain sight, and the extinguished fire pit betrayed their presence. "Let's keep this simple," Crusher continued. "You come out now, and maybe we won't make this worse than it has to be." The other bikers began spreading out, searching the area. A couple of them carried flashlights, sweeping the beams across the trees. Dylan and Jack exchanged a glance. They could either confront the gang now or try to slip away unnoticed. Neither option was ideal. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Plan?" Dylan tightened his grip on the flashlight. We split them up. Take out the ones on the edges first. Jack grinned, the glint of adrenaline in his eyes. Now we're talking. The first biker never saw it coming. Dylan moved like a shadow, grabbing the man from behind and silencing him with a swift chokehold. He lowered the unconscious body to the ground and signaled to Jack, who was already creeping toward the next target. Jack's approach was less subtle. He lunged at the second biker, a large man with a crowbar, and tackled him to the ground. The two grappled briefly before Jack delivered a sharp elbow to the man's temple, knocking him out cold. But the scuffle alerted the others. "Over here!" One of the bikers shouted, swinging his flashlight toward the sound. The beam landed on Jack just as he was rising to his feet. The remaining bikers charged, their weapons raised. Dylan stepped out of the shadows, his flashlight aimed directly into Crusher's face. The sudden burst of light blinded the gang leader, giving Dylan the opening he needed. He slammed the flashlight into Crusher's jaw, sending him reeling. The clearing erupted into chaos. The fight was brutal and unrelenting. Dylan and Jack fought with the precision of seasoned soldiers, their every move calculated to neutralize the threat. Chains clashed against makeshift weapons, grunts of pain echoing in the night. But the bikers were relentless, their numbers forcing Dylan and Jack to constantly adapt. Crusher, blood dripping from his mouth, managed to recover. He grabbed a fallen chain and swung it toward Dylan, who barely ducked in time. The chain wrapped around a tree trunk, giving Dylan a moment to close the distance. He delivered a sharp kick to Crusher's knee, sending him crashing to the ground. Meanwhile, Jack found himself cornered by two bikers, both armed. He dodged a swing from a tire iron, retaliating with a brutal punch to the nearest man's throat. But the second attacker caught him off guard, slamming a bat into his side. Jack stumbled, grimacing in pain. "Jack!" Dylan shouted, sprinting to his friend's aid. He tackled the second biker, driving him into the dirt. When the dust settled, the clearing was littered with bodies. Some bikers were groaning in pain, others unconscious. Crusher lay sprawled near the truck, his breath shallow. Dylan helped Jack to his feet. "You good?" Jack winced, pressing a hand to his ribs. "I've been worse." As they surveyed the aftermath, the distant sound of sirens reached their ears. Someone must have called the cops. Dylan and Jack exchanged a look. "We need to go," Dylan said. Jack nodded. "Yeah, but this isn't over." Dylan glanced down at Crusher, whose eyes flickered open for a moment. A faint smile played on the gang leader's bloodied lips. "No," Dylan muttered. "It's not." The truck sped down the dark highway, its tires kicking up gravel as Dylan pushed the engine harder. Jack sat in the passenger seat, wincing as he pressed a hand against his ribs. The faint glow of red and blue lights appeared in the distance behind them, police cars responding to the chaos at the campsite. Dylan glanced in the rearview mirror. "They're not chasing us yet. We've got a head start." Jack nodded, his breath labored. "Good. Last thing we need is to explain this mess." Silence filled the cab, the adrenaline slowly ebbing. But as the sirens faded into the night, Dylan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. The look in Crusher's eyes just before they left, the unsettling mixture of pain and defiance, lingered in his mind. "This isn't over," Dylan said, more to himself than to Jack. Jack shifted uncomfortably, his tone light despite the weight of his words. "You've said that already. How about we focus on getting somewhere safe first?" They drove for hours, leaving the campsite far behind and venturing deeper into the remote countryside. By dawn, they found themselves in a small, run-down town with a single motel. The neon sign flickered weakly, and the parking lot was nearly empty. Inside, the motel receptionist, a wiry man with thick glasses, barely looked up as Dylan handed him cash for a room. One night, Dylan said, keeping his voice low. The room was sparse but clean, with 2 small beds and a bathroom that smelled faintly of bleach. Jack collapsed onto one of the mattresses with a groan. Dylan locked the door, checked the windows, and pulled the curtains shut. "We're lying low," Dylan said, "at least until we figure out our next move." Jack propped himself up on one elbow. "And what's the plan? Just keep running? Because if Crusher's got half a brain, he'll track us." Dylan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he paced the room, his mind racing. The Steel Vultures were more than a random gang. Their organization, their numbers, it all pointed to something bigger. And Crusher's parting words suggested this wasn't just about revenge. There was something deeper driving them. A sharp knock on the door broke his thoughts. Both men froze, their hands instinctively reaching for the knives they'd packed. "Who is it?" Dylan called, his voice tense. "Relax," came a woman's voice. "I'm here to help." Dylan and Jack exchanged a glance, neither of them moving. The knock came again, firmer this time. "Look, I don't have all day. Either you open this door or I leave. And trust me, you'll want to hear what I have to say." After a moment's hesitation, Dylan unlocked the door but didn't open it completely. A woman stood in the hallway, her arms crossed. She looked to be in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail and sharp eyes that scanned the room behind him. "My name's Sarah," she said, "and if you want to survive what's coming, you'll let me in." Sarah stepped into the room, her presence commanding despite her unassuming appearance. She glanced at Jack, who was still lying on the bed, and then at Dylan, who had yet to lower his guard. "I know about the Steel Vultures," she began, "and I know they're after you." Dylan's eyes narrowed. "Who are you exactly?" "I used to be one of them," Sarah said bluntly, "until I realized they weren't just a gang. They're part of something much worse." Jack sat up, wincing but intrigued. "What do you mean, something worse?" Sarah pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket and placed it on the table. It was a map, marked with several red circles. "The Vultures are just the face of an operation that stretches across the state. Drugs, weapons, trafficking, they're involved in all of it. And Crusher isn't just their leader. He's their enforcer. If he's after you, it's because someone higher up told him to be." Dylan studied the map, his jaw tightening. "Why would they care about us? We stopped them at a gas station. That doesn't warrant this kind of response." Sarah hesitated, then met his gaze. "You embarrassed them. In their world, that's enough. But it's not just about pride. If word gets out that 2 random guys took down Crusher and his crew, it'll make them look weak. And in their line of work, weakness invites competition." Jack let out a low whistle. "Great, so now we're targets because we bruised their egos." Sarah ignored him, focusing on Dylan. "They won't stop until they've taken you out. And if Crusher reports this to his bosses, they'll send more than just bikers next time." Dylan folded his arms, his mind working through the possibilities. "Why are you helping us?" Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Because I know what they're capable of. I've seen what they do to people who get in their way, and I don't want anyone else to go through that." Jack leaned back, his skepticism evident. "So, what's your plan, Sarah? Because hiding out in motels isn't going to cut it." Sarah smiled faintly. "You don't hide, you fight back, but you have to be smart about it." The next few hours were a blur of planning and preparation. Sarah led Dylan and Jack to a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building was filled with supplies, maps, weapons, surveillance equipment. It was clear she had been planning for a confrontation like this for a long time. "They operate out of a compound about 50 miles from here," Sarah explained, pointing to one of the red circles on her map. "It's heavily guarded, but it's also where they store most of their cash and weapons. If you hit them there, you'll cripple them." Jack raised an eyebrow. And how exactly are we supposed to do that? It's 3 of us against how many? Sarah's smile was grim, enough to make it interesting. Dylan studied the map, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. We'll need explosives and a distraction. Sarah nodded. Already taken care of. Jack groaned, rubbing his temples. I knew this camping trip was a bad idea. Dylan smirked, his first hint of humor since the night began. Guess you'll have to tough it out. The plan was set. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the 3 of them prepared to take the fight to the steel vultures. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about sending a message. And this time, they weren't holding back. The roar of the explosion echoed through the woods as flames engulfed the steel vultures' compound. Dylan, Jack, and Sarah stumbled away from the burning wreckage, coughing and bruised but alive. The night sky was painted orange, embers floating like fireflies in the air. Jack collapsed against the truck, clutching his ribs. Tell me that's the last time I have to outrun a damn explosion, he muttered, wincing. Sarah checked the area, her sharp eyes scanning the perimeter for any sign of pursuit. When she was satisfied, she leaned against the truck, her breathing heavy. That hit them where it hurts, she said. They won't recover from this. Dylan stood apart, staring back at the inferno. His face was unreadable, his mind miles away. The weight of what they had done, and what it had cost, pressed down on him like a stone. Jack noticed his silence and nudged Sarah. He gets like that sometimes. Let him think. He'll be fine. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She approached Dylan carefully, her voice soft. We did what we had to. You know that, right? Dylan didn't look at her. I know. His voice was low, steady, but tinged with something deeper. But it doesn't feel like a victory. The drive back to town was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. When they finally stopped at a diner just outside the city, the faint light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. They sat in a corner booth, the smell of coffee and bacon filling the air, but none of them touched their food. Jack broke the silence, raising his mug in a half-hearted toast. To surviving. Dylan gave a faint smile but didn't lift his own cup. He stared at the table, his hands resting flat against the surface. Sarah leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. What's on your mind? Dylan finally met her gaze. It's not over. We stopped Crusher, but the people behind him, they'll keep pushing. They always do. Jack groaned. Come on, Dylan. Just once, can we enjoy the fact that we're still breathing? Dylan shook his head, his eyes distant. This isn't just about us. We've seen what these people do, the lives they destroy. If we walk away now, what happens to the next guy who crosses their path? Sarah sighed, her expression torn. You're right, but it's not your fight anymore. You've done enough. Dylan looked at her, his jaw tight. Enough? We stopped one compound, one gang. That's a drop in the ocean. Jack leaned back, crossing his arms. And what? You want to take down an entire criminal network? Just the 3 of us? Dylan didn't answer, but the determination in his eyes said everything. As they left the diner, the early morning sun bathed the empty parking lot in a soft golden light. Sarah stopped Dylan before he climbed into the truck. If you go down this road, it doesn't end. You know that, right? He nodded, his expression calm. It never does. But we don't fight because we think we'll win. We fight because it's the right thing to do. Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. If you ever need backup, you know where to find me. Jack sighed heavily as he climbed into the truck, pulling the door shut. Well, I guess the fishing trip's off. Again. Dylan smirked, starting the engine. We'll get there someday. They drove off, the sun rising behind them, illuminating the road ahead. For now, the fight was over, but the scars it left behind would linger. Dylan and Jack knew they might never find the peace they were searching for, but as long as they could make a difference, they wouldn't stop trying. And somewhere, in the ashes of the Steel Vulture's compound, the flames still burned.